of the East Bay, better known as EDA. I would like to welcome all of you to what is the State of the Economy, an event featuring Dr. Christopher Thornberg of Beacon Economics. Those of you who've been involved with East Bay EDA may recall that back in May of 2020, just 2 months after the region-wide shelter-in-place orders were implemented, that's the last time that we had an opportunity to hear from Dr. Christopher Thornberg, and no one knew at that time how long the shelter-in-place would be in place here in California or across the country. But he had a very interesting forecast, a lot of which is still being realized and true today. East Bay EDA is pleased to be doing this event in partnership with the Industrial Association of Contra Costa County. In a moment, I'll be inviting the board president to say a few words and introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Christopher Thornberg. But before we begin this program, I want to express our appreciation to all of you for turning out today to hear more about what's happening in the economy right now. As we know, the last 15 months have been unprecedented in so many ways, and we are glad that we're now emerging from the most significant impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, making today's presentation all that more timely. Let me now turn the program over to the event partner, the Industrial Association of Contra Costa County, and the president of the board, Peter McGraw, to say a few things, to also introduce our sponsors and introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Christopher Thornberg. Following Dr. Thornberg's presentation, my colleague on the Contra Costa supervisors, Candace Anderson, and also vice president of East Bay EDA, will be moderating questions and answers from the audience. And again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Supervisor Carson. It's great to see you. Thank you, everybody. I want to acknowledge that this is a great collaboration between the Industrial Association and the East Bay EDA. It's something we've wanted to do for a while, and I'm really glad to see it coming to fruition. I'm Peter McGraw. I'm the president of the Industrial Association of Contra Costa County, which is an organization dedicated to promoting the manufacturing sector, which of course provides the best paying jobs out there for normal people. So let's keep our manufacturing going. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Christopher Thornberg with us. Many of you probably know him, but just briefly, he founded Beacon Economics back in 2006, I think. I've known him since before then. He is one of the best respected research organizations in California. Beacon is. They serve both private and public sector clients across the United States. Dr. Thornberg is also the director of the UC Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, and he's an adjunct professor at that school as well. Chris consults for private and public agencies, private sector, and I think he really was recognized for his prediction of the subprime mortgage crash in 2007. And he was one of just a few economists that accurately predicted the global economic recession that followed that crash. He holds a PhD in business economics from the Anderson School at UCLA and a BS from business administration from the State University of New York in Buffalo. I've known Chris for decades. Very, very pleased to have him. He's one of the few people I know who can take a very dry subject like economics and make it both educational, informative, and entertaining at the same time. Chris, it's great to have you. I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Keith. Peter, I'm a little annoyed at the decades comment. You're dating me. I'm not sure. But with that in mind, it is great to be back to talk with folks both at IACCC and of course East Bay EDA, who I have such a long relationship with. These are such interesting times, fascinating times, and obviously there's a lot of talk about. And of course the real question is where the heck is this economy? If you're like me and you're picking up the papers, and I thought a year ago things were confusing, they're incredibly confusing now. And of course, if you're a policymaker, if you're a business person, and you're getting all these mixed messages, you got to ask yourself what is going on. That's what we're going to try to hone down to today. Here's an example. These are all headlines I grabbed from just this really in June of this year. You have states turning off unemployment, and there's a lot of folks worried about that. I have 88 cents in my bank account. On the other hand, we also saw a record number of job openings, 9.3 million in April, not even June. This is April data. Never has it been that high. So again, people are out of work when we have record job openings. Or how about these two headlines? Bloomberg versus the LA Times. Bloomberg says California defies doom with the #1 US economy. Every metric you look at, California is succeeding beyond really most any other state in the union right now. And yet at the same time, we're hearing about, of course, California facing an eviction tsunami, and an analysis by Policy Link suggests 900,000 households are behind on rent, thousands of dollars in debt, and are on the verge of eviction. What's going on? Will the real economy please stand up? Well, to be clear, to just kind of start this presentation off, what I want to do is just give you an overview of some of the big points that I want to discuss today, and then show you the data on these things. First of all, we have to understand that this is a completely different kind of business cycle than the last time around. And too often, too many times, too many cases, what you have is people looking at current data through the lens of what happened in the Great Recession. But this is so completely different than what happened during the Great Recession, as that lens is giving you a completely distorted view of what's going on. For example, right off the bat, when we entered this pandemic, the US economy was phenomenally healthy relative to where we were in 2007. In other words, this is an economy that was far more able to weather a storm. There's little doubt of the tragedy of the disaster itself. Millions of people obviously have passed. Millions of families are grieving. Our hearts have to go out to those folks. This has been a true global natural disaster. That's the way to think about it. But history shows us the natural disasters, as tragic as they are for the population, don't have long-term economic consequences. That's when I was with you last year in May, and I discussed the idea of the V. I said, this is going to be a V. I said that largely because, again, the study of natural disasters suggests these things just don't have the same consequences. The fiscal and monetary policy reactions to the crisis have been overwhelming. And this, of course, goes to the politics of the time. You know, I think what happened during the Great Recession and how the politics at the time led to, of course, one party basically putting the brake on any kind of major stimulus. And that slow pace of stimulus was one of the reasons it was such a slow recovery. Not the only reason, there are plenty of other reasons, but it was a significant reason. This time, the politics of the time came together in a slightly different way. It's amazing the difference 6 months before versus 6 months after an election. But because it was happening 6 months before an election, you had a situation where both parties were competing to put stimulus into place. It was a political race to who could throw more money at the wall. And as a result of that, we've had one of the most phenomenal overreactions to a crisis that was never going to be as bad as it was last time. This means that the recovery is even more spectacularly quick. And as we see from the data, we're almost there. That is to say, we're almost completely out of this thing. However, the excessive degree of stimulus, both monetary and fiscal, will leave the US economy in a peculiar position where we're going to see a lot of instabilities in this next expansion. There are costs to monetary and fiscal policy, and we're going to be suffering those costs. But with all this in mind, was going to be a relatively quick recovery. What was a pandemic that hit a relatively healthy economy with a phenomenal degree of overreaction. This thing has really almost been washed away. We are looking at getting back to long-run trend by the end of this quarter. That is to say, this month. The data suggests right now that in total, this is going to end up being a 6-quarter business cycle. Contrast that to a 9-year business cycle during the Great Recession. And by 9 years, what I mean is from the beginning of the downturn to full recovery, getting back to long run trend. This time, 6 months. We're already out of the woods, despite all the words you're hearing. And then why the labor markets, right? Why are we seeing unemployment? Why do we hear about the tough times? And look, there's little doubt that some portion of households in the United States continue to struggle. It's been an extraordinary year. It's put a lot of stresses and strains on the fabric of our economy. But those who are struggling are actually the minority. Overall, the health of American workers looks remarkably strong. And indeed, the consequences of this recession for workers and inequality is the exact opposite of what happened during the Great Recession. We're going to come back to that. There's a lot to talk about in that front. Housing, we know, is on fire. Again, we hear how terrible the economy is, yet home prices are going through the roof. The housing situation is interesting. It's reflective of the underlying strength of the economy, the underlying enormity of the stimulus, but actually, it's not as bad of a situation as you might think. Housing is not a bubble. The gains we're seeing are actually reasonable. And as for eviction crises, they don't exist anywhere in the United States, much less here in California, as I'll come back to. What it really means, and I really had to sum it up this way, as a nation, we need to take a step back from what I would call crisis policy, from crisis politics. The crisis is behind us. The vaccinations are out. And as long as we continue to get people vaccinated, this thing's behind us. The economy's recovered. If anything, we're going to go into a period of time of excessive growth. That means we need to take a step back, push aside some of these crisis policies, and start focusing on the next expansion. Now, that's difficult. That's not what you're hearing in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. And again, the politics of the country, of the state, have encouraged what I would call an excessive degree of focus on the crisis rather than on the expansion. We need to start shifting this. We need to start having different conversations about what next, because that's where the economy is. So lots to talk about. Let's just jump right into it. We all remember where we were a little over a year ago. Across the board, incredibly dismal predictions. Home prices are going to fall. 30 to 40 million people are going to be evicted. They're calling it a depression-like crisis. The U versus V debate. If you remember, we said V. It's not that kind of business cycle. And lo and behold, the V really did take place. Now, it wasn't as clean as I originally hoped because of the huge surge in cases at the end of the year. But, you know, even by the end of the year, even in the face of that enormous surge at the end of the year, we had already regained 70% of the ground we lost in the first few weeks. This was the deepest recession in U.S. economic history. And when measured from peak to trough, it's also the shortest. It was only a couple months recession. Contrast that to the 6-quarter recession during the Great Recession. It was a completely different kind of situation. Why so different? Well, let's think about a few things. As already noted, last time the pre-recession economy was highly overheated by the subprime lending bubble. We had problems in consumer debt, problems with quality and quantity of that particular debt. Home markets were clearly in a major bubble, so on and so forth. The financial system was up with its eyeballs in bad debt and derivatives. This time around, we came into this particular pandemic situation with a slow, steady growth economy. Wasn't very exciting from a growth rate perspective, but the fundamentals were actually very, very good. Consumer finances back then, a record high debt to income ratio, record low savings rate. This time we had a record low financial obligations ratio and actually a 30-year high savings rate. Housing back then, massive bubble, both in terms of prices and overbuilding and overborrowing. This time around, we actually came into the pandemic with a fundamentally healthy housing market, despite, of course, all those claims we heard in the beginning of 2019 about the housing meltdown that never occurred. The recession driver. This is probably the most important point, how different this was. Look, when you think about the Great Recession, it was a traditional demand shock, where that's how most recessions actually start. What I mean by a demand shock is home prices and asset prices across the board collapsed. We saw a collapse in household wealth. A lot of households suddenly realized I got way too much debt, not enough wealth, and I have to rebuild for the future. That means I have to cut back on my expenditures and save more. Now, that excessive amount of saving in the short run, which was really rebuilding wealth, caused a situation where we had a general malaise across the entire economy. Some sectors like housing got hurt more and consumer finance got hurt more, but it was a general problem across the entire economy. This time it was absolutely different. It was a supply shock, not a demand shock. What I mean by that is last year, when people stopped going to restaurants, it wasn't because they couldn't afford to go to restaurants, because they weren't allowed to go to restaurants. They weren't allowed by a government official. They weren't allowed by fear of the disease. Now, the reason that's important is if you're denied the ability to spend money in one place of the economy that's been cut off to you, a natural response of a consumer is to spend it someplace else. So as opposed to having bad parts of the economy that are very bad and the rest of the economy being a little bit bad, this time around you had some parts of the economy that were really bad, restaurants, hotels, but that demand shifted over to other parts of the economy and created actually a fairly hot economy in those parts of the economy, which offset a lot of the damage that was occurring in those hard hit sectors. Completely different kind of situation. And as noted, government stimulus too little, too late, too much, too soon. So where are we now with this different kind of business cycle? Well, take a look at the right-hand side. You can see overall where we're at, about a 2.4% output gap after starting at about a 14% output gap, 70% recovery coming into this particular 80% recovery as the case may be. Indeed, the output gap right now is only about 2.4%. Growth in the first quarter was 6.4%, a very solid number overall. And by the way, it's worth pointing out that at this particular point in time, whether you're looking at the blue chip consensus or the GDP now numbers, we're predicting somewhere in a 9 to 10% growth rate for the second quarter. Now that's about 2.5%. In other words, that's it. That closes the output gap. As of Q2, we're back up and running. Now, it's not, we're back overall from an aggregate standpoint up and running, but it's not the same economy as we saw pre-pandemic. What you have, of course, is overall the same amount of economic activity, but some sectors are ahead and some sectors are behind. It's a kind of a win or lose recovery. Take a look at the left-hand side. This is trends, of course, in different times of real consumer spending. Durables are way above trend. People are still aren't going to Disneyland very much, so they're buying campers. Anybody who tried to buy a bicycle last Christmas knows exactly what I'm talking about, just how strong demand for products has been. Non-durables is slightly above trend, services are below trend. On the right-hand side, from February to February, I'm using February because it gives us a good bracket pre and post-pandemic. Online retailers, sporting stores, hardware stores, food stores, auto dealers, all much busier than they were the previous February pre-pandemic. On the other hand, restaurants, bars, clothing stores still behind, trying to catch up as the case may be. So an uneven recovery, even if a full recovery. You can see, of course, the big bounce back in goods spending in a lot of the numbers on the East Bay. Take taxable sales, for example, which after one bad quarter kind of bounced back to the level it was at in pre-pandemic. Fairly good numbers. Overall, the East Bay only saw about a 7% decline in taxable sales last year. This year, you should be up pretty substantially. Again, the bounce back is apparent. Yes, some restaurants are suffering, but other parts of the economy are doing great. And of course, you get a little closer. This is data on business activity in the East Bay. This is information from Opportunity Insights. The high frequency data gets into May of this particular year. And you can see, again, this weird mix, right? Business openings still way down, but consumer spending actually above where it was pre-pandemic, at least according to the credit card records that these guys operate. So it's an interesting place we're in. From an aggregate standpoint, we're much better off. And with a big, of course, bounce back in goods spending, and has brought back the industrial part of the US economy. On the left-hand side, take a look at the giant hit to industrial production during the Great Recession and how many years it took back to get close to the previous peak. We never quite got back there. This time around, just a few months to get back to previous levels of economic activity. And yes, it slowed down over the last couple of months, but that had nothing to do with demand. It had everything to do with, of course, that demand has been so frenetic, so above trend, that producers are just having a tough time keeping up. They're hitting supply chain problems because there simply isn't enough capacity in supply chains to keep up with the above trend level of demand for durable and non-durable goods. take a look at the right-hand side. This is inventory to sales ratios, and I'm focusing on retail and autos in particular. Look how tight these numbers are. They continue to fall. Demand is still outstripping overall production. And what that means, of course, is that these strong trends of productions, the strong change and the strong needs of expanding supply chains will remain in place for a while as we continue to try and catch up to where things have been. And that's one of the reasons why trade has come back so frenetic. Again, nobody was really prepared for this. Shipping companies weren't, the ports weren't, but here it is. Now, the overall trade numbers are weak, but when you break it down between services and goods, you can see why. Goods trades is right back to where it was. Service trades, which of course includes particularly global tourism, still way down. Parts of the economy back, parts of the economy still trying to catch up. And of course, the problems in supply chains has caused a big surge in prices. Now, it's interesting because the Federal Reserve has gone out of the way to say that the price increases we're seeing today, these big increases in CPI, are largely transitory, driven, of course, by these supply chain problems. And I agree with that assessment in a very limited short-run situation. This is largely transitory. For example, lumber prices are already starting to come back down. But it's a little bit blasé to suggest that inflation is not a problem. It can still be a problem. In fact, I expect it still will be a problem, but we're going to come back to that just a little later. Of course, if you think about California, if you think about of the East Bay, Port of Oakland actually had a great year last year. Exports were actually up a little bit, imports down a little bit. Again, think how much trade there was at the end of the year to help offset that horrible second quarter of the year. Things have been bouncing back, lots of capacity. Obviously, good news for the region. As for tech itself, tech exports have been doing pretty good. They were down a bit in 2020, but 2021 is already on trend. You know how important this is for the Bay Area economy, for Bay Area, of course, industrial production. Again, doing pretty well at this particular point in time. And thinking yet again about the winner-loser aspect, we can continue to talk about the businesses that are suffering that aren't back in terms of profitability, but we also have to include the companies that have seen excessive demand, and as a result, their profits are above normal. Again, you never hear about the other side of the equation. You always hear about the pain. You don't hear about the offsetting gains in this supply shock type system. And you can see a huge surge in investment in computers, other IT equipment. Hey, we all have to be ready to do Zoom, right? Residential structures are way up. Software is way up. So some parts of business investment are coming back. On the right-hand side, corporate profits have already bounced back. Indeed, by the end of last year, they were above trend. Very solid numbers. Again, I just can't reiterate this enough, just how great these numbers are. Venture capital had a great year last year. I'm showing you San Jose here. Yes, a big year for San Jose, up about 20%. Overall deal count's about the same. Mountain Venture up 20%. Reason I'm showing you San Jose is I now want to show you East Bay. Obviously, overall, a smaller place for investment, still less than 50% of San Jose. But look at the jump. Your jump you're talking about is a 66% in terms of the money pouring into the East Bay last year. So an amazing year. You can see on the right-hand side, some of those companies that get good big payouts. Wow. Great tech expansion in the East Bay. A lot of good things happening. And the last part of this, look, we all understand how restaurants and hotels are being left behind. They are no longer being left behind. Obviously, the vaccinations are rolling out. They're kicking in. As much as we talk about the Delta variant, it is still, the vaccine is still effective against it. In the state of California, we're close to 63% of all adults that have at least one dose, which makes them reasonably inoculated to this situation. And lo and behold, the other parts of the economy, the stuff that's been lagging, the service side of the economy are coming back. Restaurants overall in the US, California, are almost back to where they were pre-Great Recession. Entertainment and recreation still off about 10%, transportation off about 15%, that's airplanes. But again, we're getting there. Take a look at Oakland Airport versus California's overall airport. Just in the last few weeks, you can see the big jump. People are starting to travel. Things are starting to turn back on. That last part of the recovery, getting tourism, business travel back up and running, that's starting to happen now. And it's only the beginning. Here's one of my most important forecasts for you. You can see hotels are up. If you're going to do any travel this year, I suggest you book early. ASTA did a survey. They said, what are you going to do after the pandemic ends? And basically everybody said travel. You're already starting to see the chaos at the airports. It's going to get more and more intense over the course of this particular year. Be prepared. A lot of things happening out there. Now, with all this in mind, first question you have to ask yourself is, wait a minute. I thought our economy was doing terrible. You're telling me we're fully recovered. Parts of the economy are doing better than normal. Yet, we're short 7.5 million jobs. What is going on? Payrolls down 7.6 million jobs. Household employment, which of course is a different way of looking at it, includes the self-employed, down 7 million jobs. Unemployment rates have dropped a lot. There's no doubt about it. The headline rate is below 6%, but that's still 2.5 percentage points above where it was pre-pandemic. The U6, which includes discouraged workers, still running about 10%. The numbers are down, but still inflated. How can we have such a healthy economy and have our labor market still showing such signs of distress? Same thing in California, where we're down still about 1 million jobs. Not everywhere. Logistics and construction is doing great. But you can see, for example, accommodation and food services down 380,000 jobs statewide, still down 22% coming into May of this particular year relative to 2 years ago. The East Bay down about 107,000 jobs as of April. A lot of those jobs, of course, education, health, retail, trade, government, and leisure and hospitality, by far and away the largest, 41,000 jobs. How do we square this? How do we think about the idea that these labor markets look so weak when the rest of the economy looks so hot? Well, look, the way to think about this is to take a step back and recognize that, when you don't see jobs forming, there's two ways of thinking about those jobs not being in the economy. One is a lack of labor supply, and the other is a lack of labor demand. The typical interpretation of what's happening out there in policy circles, political circles, and in the press is that this is a labor demand problem. People desperately want to work, but they can't find jobs. But that is completely upended when we take a look at the US job openings. Over 9 million job openings in April of this year, 2 million higher than the highest point it had ever been. We've never seen anything like that. And I can't even imagine what the May numbers are going to look like. They're probably going to be over 10 million when they finally come out. What's going on out there, particularly in leisure and hospitality? Well, again, remember supply shock versus demand shock? It's the same idea here. If this is a demand shock, there are certain features we should see in the labor market, such as we saw after the Great Recession. If there's a labor demand shock, wage growth should be weak. It should be particularly bad for low-skilled workers. You should be seeing, of course, people clutching their jobs because they're worried about what's next, if anything. However, if it's a labor supply problem, that is to say these jobs are going unfilled because there's no one to fill them, well, that has a completely different set of economic outcomes. Labor shortage problems actually fits the data much better than labor demand problems do. Take a look on the right-hand side here. Total quits, people voluntarily leaving work, 4 million in April. Never been that high. It isn't just a function of you hiring people to fill spots. It's also a function that you're having a tough time keeping your folks because they're happy to leave and go look somewhere else. This is a labor supply problem. Now, why do we have a labor supply problem? Well, again, when you start talking about these sort of things from a political standpoint, or from a press standpoint, they always want to boil it down to one thing, and it's not. It's a bunch of different factors that come together that have created this interesting situation. Some of it's short run and will work its way out of the system. Some of it's long run and it won't. So what am I talking about? Well, one basic issue is skill mismatches. Remember, it's been a little bit of a different balance in terms of economic activity. And you don't necessarily take somebody who was a line cook and turn them into a manufacturing worker overnight. It takes a little time to do that. These skill mismatches are just a function of the training and just employers and employees finding each other. It'll work its way out of the system a little bit in 6 months. We have to remember that a bunch of people who are unemployed right now aren't unemployed in a traditional sense. They're still on temporary layoff. They're not really looking for a job. They're just waiting for their job to come back. We have high unemployment payments, which, yes, make a difference. Now, how they make a difference, again, I think has been slightly misinterpreted out there. And I'll come back to that in just a second. Labor force retirees, a lot of folks chose this point in time to retire. And last but not least, let's remember we came into the pandemic already dealing with a national labor supply problem driven by demographic changes. Here's a way to thinking about it. If I just do a raw counting, and I'll show you some of these numbers in a second, we're down about 7.5 million household jobs. If you look at unemployment now relative to pre-pandemic, there's about 4 million additional unemployed. Remember, there's always going to be a few million people unemployed. That's the nature of a labor market. So there's 4 million additional unemployed. 1 million of those are on temporary layoff. So that means 3 million people new unemployed looking for jobs. Now, where's everybody else? Well, 3.5 million people are not in the workforce anymore. And 60% plus of these are actually early retired. They have no plans to come back. So when you factor this in, what you end up with is this number right here. 9.2 million job openings for 3 million workers currently looking for a job that are truly out there looking for a job, and 1.5 million potential reentrants, people waiting to reenter the labor force. Maybe they're waiting for childcare to turn on or something like that. Well, that's a 2-to-1 ratio. That is heavily in labor's favor. Now, go through some of these numbers, back out some of these situations. Well, again, we came into this pandemic from a long-run situation with a long-run issue with just basic demographics. You have a situation by which population of people in their prime working age has actually been falling because, of course, boomers starting to retire. You can see our population pyramid is turning into a population column. And that, of course, means labor force growth is simply not there. Of course, our problem in the state of California is compounded by the lack of housing supply, not affordability. There are no empty units in the state. Sheer supply that, of course, continues to push people out to other states where there is affordable housing supply in general. We had yet another year of massive outflows of people. On a percentage basis, number 6 in the nation. Housing supply, simple as that. The retirement situation. Look, if you look on the right-hand side, a big decline in overall labor force. And yes, you see some of the signs of stress on the economy, particularly for women, say, from 35 to 44-year-old. A lot of those women have dropped out of the workforce, probably because they're been constrained to stay at home with kids who don't have daycare, they don't have their school open. But that's not the big part of the decline in labor force. The big part are people 55 and over, men and women, just dropping out, retiring. On the left-hand side, according to data from the Reserve Bank of Dallas, you're talking about a full percentage point of about a couple million people have decided to retire as a result of the pandemic. Again, that's a huge problem for the labor market. Share of unemployed, temporary layoff, that's still about 20% of those 6-7 million people. That's 1.5 million who are on temporary layoff, 1 million, 1.5 million. These folks aren't really looking for a job. And then, of course, yes, the unemployment benefits. Unemployment has multiple programs right now. Even coming into the last few weeks, there are still about 15 million different types of unemployment checks going out for an overall population of about 7 million unemployed people. That means on average, every unemployed person is getting 2 checks, which of course means they're getting a fair amount of economic support. Now, the story on that, by the way, is that, well, by giving people all this money, you're telling them they don't, you're making them not want to work. They don't want to work. Well, I'm going to push back on that idea just a little bit. Look, giving people money, keeping them economically stable, particularly in a point in time where there are a lot of job openings. Well, look, these folks get it. They say, hey, I have opportunities to find a good job with a good career path. The way I'm trying to frame this is having lots of unemployment insurance doesn't make people not want to work, but maybe they don't want to work here. You see how that works? I don't need to get a retail job. I don't need to work in a restaurant. I have the money in the bank. I can wait for, of course, that job to come to the path that gives me a life, a career, a path forward. And they are waiting. They are looking for that right job. There's nothing wrong with that. But of course, it does make the labor travails of employers that much harder. And you see this in the data. I've heard this described as a K-shaped recovery, which annoys me like crazy for two reasons. A, there's nothing new about a K-shaped recovery. The vast majority of recessions have a K-shaped recovery in as much as low-skilled work people have a tougher time than high-skilled people. This is one of the reasons that I, along with many economists, believe in skill upgrading. It helps people weather economic storms. But guess what? Of all the last few recoveries, this is not a K relative to the past recoveries. Take a look on the left-hand side. This is earnings growth by level of education. And yes, your eyes are not wrong. There's been no slowdown in wage growth for people who've continued to work through the pandemic situation, unlike during the Great Recession, where there was a huge decline for everybody. And oh, by the way, the earnings for people with a high school degree or less has been growing just as fast as people with a bachelor degree and above, higher. Now, mind you, I still appreciate that even with equal percentage growth rates, the quality gap is still there, but they're keeping up, which is unusual. Right-hand side, part-time workers have actually seen an acceleration in their pay gains, in their earnings over the course of the pandemic. How unusual is that? They completely collapsed during the Great Recession. You look at wage growth by quartile. By the way, this is all data from the Atlanta Fed. The biggest increase in earnings is for people in the bottom quartile of earnings, at the bottom, not the top. And on the right-hand side, for all these trends I'm talking about the US, it's even more extreme here in the state of California. In other words, wages are going up, inequality is falling. This is the exact opposite outcome from the Great Recession. And you can see it again in the data. On the left-hand side, average checking account balances for the bottom 50% of earners. This comes from the Dallas Federal Reserve. It has increased by over 100%. Now, I'm not suggesting that there aren't some households having struggling out there. Of course they are. Of course there's some that are struggling, trying to work forward, but it is not a general circumstance, it's a specific circumstance. And specific circumstances need targeted policies. We don't need fire hose policies over the entire economy. Targeted policies to hit those households that still need help. Very important, as always, the safety net is a primary role of government, but the overall numbers suggest things are, again, looking up. On the right-hand side, take a look at overall consumer spending by level of income. And yes, low-income households are actually spending more now relative to pre-pandemic than high-income households are. Now, again, it's not because high-income households are having a tough time. It's just that they're waiting for Disneyland and Paris to reopen. It's a different kind of conversation, but the numbers suggest things are good. And this isn't going to come to an end. Look, when you think about the federal government response, whether it's unemployment and of course the direct checks that went to households and these PPP loans, over $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus through the three plans, which is vastly, vastly more than the loss of income we saw. We've never seen anything like that. Just in terms of direct transfers to households, that is to say through unemployment of these direct checks, for every dollar of lost income, there was $3 of government subsidies handed out. 3 to 1. 3 to 1. We've never seen anything like this. And remember, the problem in our economy right now is not that people can't spend because they don't have money. The problem is they can't spend because of the supply shock. They've not been allowed to spend. Disneyland's been closed. Their favorite restaurant's been closed. When you give people money that they can't spend, that's not stimulus. It doesn't do much at all for the economy outside of make us richer on the basis of government debt. And this is a standard. This is from the first stimulus. 80% of the first stimulus money people used to save or pay down debt. They didn't spend it. They saved it or paid down debt. That's not stimulus. And how much are we talking? Take a look at the left-hand side here. Cumulative household savings, $2.2 trillion above trend. $2.2 trillion in excess savings. Money sitting there waiting to be spent. Dry powder that's going to continue to push this economy forward. Bank deposits up $3 trillion. Now, this all comes at a cost. The context is clear. The budget deficit, we're talking $6, $7, $8 trillion of borrowing over a 2 to 3 year period. We've never seen anything like this. And let's all remember, we are already running headlong into a massive problem with the entitlement programs, which our tax structure can't afford to pay given its current structure. What are we doing and why? We're giving people massive amounts of money that they can't spend right now, which is not really stimulus. Yes, some families are enjoying it, but most, I can't do anything with it. We are paying down our debt. We're saving the money. This is great. We now have the lowest financial obligation ratio. That's the percent of household income spent on financial obligations ever. All on the basis of what? Handing trillions of dollars of public debt to our children. This is not stimulus. This is intergenerational mugging, and intergenerational mugging. There's no other way to describe it than that. Trillions of dollars for our kids. And you think the asset markets are a little frothy? How about that stock market with the second highest PE? Well, again, look what people are doing. According to this is from the second stimulus, 68, 2/3 of people under 35 use their stimulus check to invest in the stock market. Stock market, second highest PE ratio ever. I mean, Bitcoin was going crazy right now. Well, when you have this much cash flowing around the system, that's what happens. And another place we've seen asset markets pop, of course, is in housing. Huge increase in sales, massive acceleration in home prices. Now, mind you, this increase in prices is not a speculative binge the way we saw, at least not yet. Things can change. What I'm seeing out there is the simple and natural market response to an incredibly tight supply. The market has not been popping. Builders have been reluctant to build a lot since the last downturn. They got hammered so bad. We haven't seen a lot of building, and suddenly everyone wants to buy. Of course they do. They got record low interest rates. They have massive amounts of money in the bank. People are trying to buy, and lo and behold, the market's tight, and people start doing crazy stuff to get into the market. Housing markets always have that kind of feedback effect. If nobody's buying, I can take my time. If everybody's buying, I got to rush out and buy it now. And of course, it moves from one direction to the other very quickly. Same thing in the East Bay. Prices leaped from 750,000 to 900,000 in less than a year. This is median prices. Sales are way, way up. Is it a bubble? No. No. In no way, shape, or form does this look like what happened in 2005, 6, and 7. That was a speculative fringe that was making housing truly expensive, and people were borrowing money they could never afford to pay back because of the collapse in credit standards. None of that's happening now. Take a look at the left-hand side here. The share of credit originations with a 720 or above FICO, as high as it's ever been. These are clean markets. On the right-hand side, the share of housing cost burden households, 35% or more, in California has dropped from 38% to 28%. Housing has been getting cheaper in California relative to the incomes of people who are buying it. It's a supply shortage in as much as certain people are being excluded from the markets, but those who can win their way in to the housing market because they simply have enough income, honestly, housing in California is reasonably affordable. I know it's hard to believe given these headline numbers, but that's what the data is telling us. The only issue with housing right now is what happens if interest rates go up, and that, of course, would occur if we saw a big increase in inflation. Come back to that in just a second. On the apartment front, rents are way down, particularly in San Francisco. We know that. Vacancy rates have drifted up just a little, but of course, the big thing has been this eviction moratorium. People can't pay. Well, again, take a step back. Let's think about what's really going on in apartments. On the left-hand side, this is median rent as a percent of household income. I've showed you this data before. Turns out in the East Bay, actually rent income ratios have not been going up, they've been going down. Now, it isn't to say we don't have a big increase in prices, but that those prices are reflecting the bidding wars and the incomes of those who are winning those bidding wars. The problem is the lack of supply that excluding certain demographics, particularly low-income families, from being able to get into the market. And yes, many of them are forced to leave. They're moving to Tracy. They're moving to the Central Valley. They're moving to Arizona or Vegas. This is a problem, but it's a problem that can be dealt with supply. That's how you fix it. The real problem in apartments in the short run is on the right-hand side. This is the home ownership rate. Remember all the people jumping into housing? Well, when you have a bunch of people jumping into housing, obviously it'll leave particularly new apartments, the ones that are more expensive, which are typically for higher income families who make that jump, well, these guys are not actually being rented right now. And so what you really have is an absorption crisis. But what about the eviction crisis we keep hearing about it? You've heard some crazy numbers. You heard that just a week ago, 900,000 people. There's not a shred of data. There's not a shred of data that supports that particular number. On the left-hand side of those who have missed payment overall in the United States, we're talking about 9%, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. That's a relatively broad sample, which includes single-family homes. On the right-hand side, this is data from the National Multifamily Housing Council, which runs that's part of a group of guys who own the big apartment buildings. And for them, they're only talking right now, about a 5% non-payment rate, which, by the way, relative to pre-pandemic, when it was a 3.5%, is only slightly above where it was. You're not seeing these massive problems out there. So why are we talking about them? Because that's politics, folks. You've seen the numbers. You understand what's happening with the governor. They're still talking about whether they extend the eviction moratorium out there at this particular point in time. They're talking about, this paying people's unpaid rent. I don't know if you paid attention to this, but there's billions of dollars in the program that haven't been handed out. The reason for that is not that the state isn't willing to give it. Plenty of landlords have been willing to fill out the paperwork to get it, but you need paperwork from the landlord and the actual tenant who has to show they have economic distress. And the problem has been in the paperwork for the tenants. They haven't been able to show that paperwork, which makes you think that at least some portion of those who aren't paying rent maybe are doing so strategically. That's particularly true for higher income folks in single family rentals. Hey, if I don't have to pay for 18 months, what a great way of getting a down payment for a new house. Now, it isn't everybody. I know that. As already noted, I know there are people out there suffering. I know they need help. What I'm saying is it's not everybody. It's a small group of people. We need tailored programs to help them rather than, again, these blanket approaches when the blanket situation doesn't exist. So again, I'm not saying no help. I'm saying targeted help. It's a different kind of thing. The good news is after a relatively weak 2020, we've already seen a nice bounce in permits for 2021. Remember, ultimately, the East Bay is short of workers, just like every place else. The East Bay needs housing to increase population growth to basically create the workers that'll continue to fuel economic growth in the region. There's so much potential right now, and housing is the best way to take advantage of that. The other thing I want to talk about, of course, is inflation. I said that's the biggest risk for housing. Why will we have inflation? Well, all goes down to the idea that the Federal Reserve has yet again really invested itself in massive amounts of quantitative easing. In terms of the sheer quantity of quantitative easing, you're talking that Jerome Powell did as much as both Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen did together. Huge intervention in the economy. And the question is why? As noted, a completely different kind of business cycle, which means the Federal Reserve is fighting a completely different kind of war. But as the old cliche goes, this general just wants to fight the last war no matter what. Last time around, quantitative ease saved the world from itself. This time around, there's no need for that. Left-hand side, you can see what happened. Back then, a collapse in household real net worth. This time, it's actually been increasing because asset markets are so hot. Last time, a massive collapse in the debt markets. We almost had a complete meltdown in our financial system. This time around, debt markets look remarkably healthy. What problems are you solving, Mr. Powell? Well, the answer is, of course, he's not. And yes, we're seeing big inflation right now and a lot of inflation expectations. Now, as already noted, I appreciate that a lot of the inflation you're seeing right now is transitory, having to do with the gummed up supply chains. But that doesn't mean we're not going to see real monetary inflation, particularly when you take a look at the left-hand side here. You can see the numbers in terms of what we call the unit money supply, the amount of money floating around the economy relative to the amount of economic transactions. We've never had so much money out there. This is what causes inflation. And of course, if inflation starts creeping in, eventually you're going to have another big problem. Because remember the confluence here. On right now, on the right-hand side, you can see the interest, but all this new debt, interest payments are still relatively low for the federal government. This is because interest rates are so low. But what happens if inflation creeps in? Well, interest rates start going up. And of course, those treasuries, suddenly their interest rates start going up. Remember, a lot of this debt will have to be refinanced because it's short-term debt. And you could see a massive increase in the cost of carrying this debt, even as inflation creeps in. Yes, I'm very worried about inflation. I'm very worried about the public debt because the confluence of these two things happening at the same time in the next few years could cause a massive problem in US public debt markets, which could in turn derail the next expansion. That's a few years from now, but believe me, the risks are clearly there. And the efforts of the Federal Reserve to simply dismiss this, to wash their hands and say there's nothing to see here, folks, to me is completely irresponsible at this particular point in time. Oops. What am I doing here? Sorry, I went backwards for some reason. Okay, commercial real estate. Last couple of things I want to talk about. Obviously, when you think about the commercial real estate markets, office is in la la land, retail actually not doing that bad, and of course, industrial proving its worth. As already noted, the financial markets are coming back, transactions are coming back, banks are making it easy to borrow again. The numbers around the Bay Area do show particularly some stress in the office space. And I got to tell you, it begs the question, most importantly, what's going to happen for office? What's going to happen for downtowns? What's going to happen in that downtown Oakland region, the downtown San Francisco region? Is the downtown dead as a result of COVID? Well, look, what this situation has showed us is, for example, we know people are going to be buying lots of stuff online, and it's yet again proven we have too much retail space, something policymakers need to deal with from a land use standpoint. As for office itself, well, I have a very specific opinion about downtowns and how cities should be thinking about downtowns. You take a look at the number, there's a lot of house stock out there. And the question is how does the downtown look post-pandemic? Well, let's start with the idea of how businesses and workers are going to respond to this. I can tell you firsthand that my company, my folks have been working from home for well over a year, and they've done great. Now, this is a different circumstance for us because we've tried to work from home before in the past. It hasn't really worked well. What you realize, of course, with the benefit of hindsight, is that is a managerial problem rather than necessarily an employee problem. We didn't put systems in place. We didn't have, of course, the kind of managerial control necessary to let people be effective from working from home. This time around, we were forced to do it. Lo and behold, people have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Still need an office, there's no doubt about it. Training, sales, camaraderie, the ability to work with your employees. You want to see them once in a while. But at the same time, I also know that folks can work from home. Now, not everybody wants to work from home all the time. About 1/4 of people, according to a survey, say it all the time. About 33% no more than 1 day per week. So not everybody's going to work from home, but some people are going to make that choice. I like the left-hand side. This came from the Atlanta Fed. Raphael Bostic from USC took over that Fed. He's done some interesting stuff over there. And take a look at, for example, business services. Overall, prior to the pandemic, about 10 out of 100 days were work from home. The survey of managers suggests about 30 will be. And this means, of course, that most companies are going to shrink their footprints. Now, isn't that bad for office? Sure it is, but not downtown. You know, downtowns are interesting because from a pure economic cost perspective, they shouldn't exist. It's expensive to work downtown. The floor space is expensive. The commute is expensive. If downtowns didn't have some offsetting, compensating differential, they wouldn't exist. They do. What are those offsetting, compensating differentials? You're close to your clients. You're close to liquid labor markets. You're close to your vendors. There's a panache to being downtown. Your workers appreciate it more. In other words, these external economies of scale offset the increased costs. Now imagine what happens in a downtown region when everybody cuts their footprint by 15%. Suddenly there's 15% more room, prices come down, cost versus benefit, costs relative to benefits become lower, people start moving downtown. In other words, the prediction is the pandemic is going to make downtowns more important in the post-pandemic world, not less. And cities, regions all have to redouble, refocus their efforts on rebuilding and improving their downtown regions to get ready for this. And of course, the suburbs are going to see out-migration, jobs, offices leaving that region. They're going to become more inclined towards being residential. And that's how land use planners should think about it. Let's anticipate a world where there are more people working downtown, although not every day. And of course, at the same time, suburbs are going to be a little bit more suburban. We could deal with that. The world can continue to work, but we need to make the plans for that new reality. All right, there was a lot in there. We're going to have some time for Q&A, which I'm excited about. But let me just kind of wrap it up here. The economy is back. The V was the only logical outcome. And while it stalled briefly at the end of last year, it has bounced back. And again, by the end of this particular quarter, the output gap will be completely closed. And really for the next year and a half, the US economy is going to be overheated. We're going to be producing above trend because the massive amount of dry powder in the economy. Strong growth, labor market is going to continue to be tight. Global tourism will lag a bit, but of course, it's got to get there. In the next year, you're going to see all sorts of things happening. Forecast wildcards, there's always a few. Obviously, there could be a new variant of the virus that is truly resistant to the vaccine. Hasn't happened yet. We got to worry about financial bubbles in the stock market, the potential for inflation, the public debt explosion. Yes, even labor shortage issues. But overall, the economy is in really good shape. The biggest issues we're facing, of course, out there, labor markets and the slow recovery there. This is actually good for workers. So while you watch the slow pace of jobs getting back to where they were pre-pandemic, remember it's labor supply. This is good for workers. It reduces inequality. It is bad for businesses. It is bad for consumers. It's going to drive costs up. It's going to make businesses have a tough time catching up to where they were. But if you're a business person out there, here's the word. This isn't changing. It's not going away. Yes, eventually we'll encourage people to come back to the labor market some, but it's not going to be enough. As a nation, as an individual business, policymakers need to be thinking about how do we assist an economy that's short bodies. And that is, of course, having to do with productivity enhancements, capital improvements, changing the way you do business. Another big issue out there, of course, miserabilism. This is my ongoing problem I have, where we're just not willing to have conversations about the economy. We continue to run policy in crisis mode, despite the fact that the crisis is largely behind us. Time to refocus on real issues driven by real data. And as for policy thoughts, just a few things. Again, let's walk away from eviction moratoriums. Let's have narrow policies to help people who need it. And at the same time, start refocusing on our long-run issues. The lack of housing supply being first and foremost, the desperate need for infrastructure investments behind that. At a more national level, we got to think about labor supply. Fixing immigration, of course, is one of the ways of doing that. And another one is to take a step back and think about programs that will help encourage seniors to come back into the labor market, or indeed policies that help women get away from childcare needs and again, get back into the labor market the way Europe does, say through expanded pre-K education program. There's lots of programs out there that can really smooth the path forward. But the only way to get there is by taking a step back again from this crisis mentality and focusing on the real trends in our economy today. Thank you very much, everybody. I realize that was a lot of material. We'll make these slides available to you as always. And with that, let me go ahead and turn it back over to our hosts and we can do a little bit of Q&A.
Okay, and I think I'm the one who gets to ask you some questions, Chris. And thank you again. As always, you're entertaining. You do make a very complex area of thought, of policy, very easy to understand. And yes, a little bit of a fire hose coming at us. So in your opinion, who was an economic winner of the pandemic?
Well, goods makers for the most part, right? They are still struggling to catch up. The production side of our economy is on fire right now. The manufacturing base is doing great. We know how important that is for the East Bay, right? I mean, after all, one of our hosts here today is the Industrial Association of Contra Costa County. So, you know, these folks are struggling to get people in the door. They're struggling to get supplies. They're struggling to keep up with demand. They're doing great. Hotels and restaurants obviously have had a tough year. They're still not out of the woods, but they are starting to see big increases in demand. You talk to most restaurant folks, again, their biggest issue is just having the staff to meet the demand. I'd love to get back to where I was pre-pandemic, but I can only open my restaurant 4 days a week. We're going to have to deal with these new realities. They are not going away anytime in the near future. And of course, labor shortages, as already noted, and I know this is completely contrary to the vast majority of what you hear, what's going on right now is really good for workers. We have these labor shortages, they're pushing wages up, there's going to be a lot of opportunities. And I will tell you now more than ever, worker training programs are one of the best places local policymakers, local governments can put their money. And this kind of atmosphere, getting particularly, we know that the large group of low-skilled workers that live in California, getting them trained, getting them into career path occupations, this is the time to do it.
Okay, and so you've talked about some industries that you sort of see bouncing back. I think hospitality is one, assuming they can get workers. Any other industries that you really see bouncing back, or is it all going to be a little bit dependent upon our supply chain and how quickly things can move?
Yeah, it is all dependent on supply chains. Again, you got to think of the idea here that the economy is basically, from an aggregate standpoint, already back to where we were pre-pandemic. We've closed the output gap, and we're going to be seeing an economy growing above its potential for the next couple of years. The biggest constraint is, as you noted, supply chains, workers and inputs, right? Now, the inputs are starting to catch up. They do. The world is figuring it out. We mitigate, we change how we do things. We're figuring out a different way. The global supply chains, the boats are moving again. The ports are busy. We'll get there. There's a lot of headaches out there for business people as they struggle with this situation. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. This labor shortage issue is not going away, and businesses need to take a step back and think about how to restructure their businesses to deal with these new realities.
Okay, great. Well, let's look a little bit more about our region. Do you see any permanent changes to our region's economy as a result of the pandemic?
Well, depending on how you're thinking about it, right? So obviously, I've done a lot of work in the East Bay over the years. I've done a lot with both counties individually as well as the MSA overall. And I can tell you that when we start thinking about the structure of the local economies, Oakland and its downtown, I think, is going to become that much more important, again, because of this consolidation in these downtown areas. I think about Contra, Costa, and Supervisor, you and I, we've had this conversation with the board, and I've talked about one of the big challenges for Contra Costa is the lack of those industrial zones. Now, you have some great not industrial zones, high dense job zones, right? Obviously, the industrial base, particularly on the north side of Contra Costa County, is really, really strong. But in terms of those dense job zones, Contra Costa doesn't have enough, and it's going to find itself struggling hard to compete for jobs with, of course, again, downtown San Francisco, downtown Oakland. And it behooves the region to think about how can we also invest in our dense job regions? How can we make them a little bit more dense? Because there are some good regions that can be worked on, but you need to kind of loosen up the zoning restrictions to encourage the kind of investments that can get there. And that means, yes, it means pushing back on some of the more anti-growth elements that exist in these local economies.
Okay, so infrastructure bill. We don't know what it's going to look like back in Washington. What do you think the impact of that's going to be? You're telling us we've got already a hot, fired up, growing economy. We've got supply chains that are slowing us down from doing what we should be able to accomplish. And you throw in an infrastructure bill that has all these new projects. How is that going to affect us?
There's an up and a down for the infrastructure bill, okay? The up is, yeah, we need this. We needed it for a while. And even though some of the parts of this infrastructure bill aren't infrastructure per se in our classic bridges and roads situation. For example, the Biden administration has been talking a lot about, say, pre-K education, childcare, in infrastructure. I agree, that is infrastructure. That should be included. Go back to the labor supply problems It helps women build their careers, drive their careers, even when they have those kids at home. Helping them rebalance that can make us look a lot more like Europe, where they have a lot more women participating actively in the labor force. And that's important for us to go to. So I'm all for it. Where I start having a problem is when they start talking about funding this through yet more debt.
Mhm.
Which, again, folks, we got to start paying the freight. I'm all for the infrastructure bill, but I think we need to increase the taxes to pay for it rather than simply put it on the credit card the way we've been doing. We need to stop that. We need to have mature conversations about paying for the stuff we're buying. And that's where I start getting nervous about the conversation.
Okay, and great points. Inflation. You spent quite a bit of time talking about inflation. It's rising at the rate we're going, it will continue. How high is it really going to go with your very predictive crystal ball that you've always done so well?
All right, you ready? Here it comes. Everybody
I'm
ready?
ready. I'm ready.
All right. I have no idea.
Okay.
Look, any economist who's honest with you would tell you that trying to predict inflation is one of the hardest things to do. It's a weird beast, and we deal with it the best we can. Now, not being able to give you a specific answer about how bad inflation could be is not my way of saying don't worry about it. When you think about where we are from a money supply perspective, when you think about that unit money supply graph, where we have more dollars relative to our economy today than we did in the high inflation 70s, what you start realizing is that where we are is completely unprecedented. We're outside historic boundaries of experience. I don't have an experiment that I can use to go out and estimate this the way I normally would. So what I can say is the risks today of inflation are higher than they've been in the 2 decades plus I've been doing this. It is a real risk. We do have to pay attention to it. I do get frustrated when I hear Powell and Yellen kind of just blowing it off like, oh, poo, poo, poo. No poo, poo, poo. No, you're doing things that haven't been done in the past. It's a very real situation. It's a very real risk. And you need to be responsible about it, because if inflation does kick in, then we have all sorts of secondary problems we've got to deal with. And remember that Volcker, when he slammed down in inflation in the early 80s, set off at that point in time, which was the worst recession in the post-World War II period. You have to pay attention to this, and you have to think about it. And if you're a business person, if you have a 401k, you have to think about efforts to hedge yourself against the potential risk of inflation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and so will voters respond? And you mentioned earlier that it's not just stimulus, it's this intergenerational mugging that's taking place. Do you see voters reacting to that, to this increasing huge federal debt, in 22? Or do you think voters, and again, asking you a political question as a politician myself, but do you think people are oblivious to it? Or do you think people will actually respond to the polls? You can say whatever you want.
I know what's in my head. I'm struggling for the right words. Look, I am frustrated with the electorate. I am frustrated with people. I just feel like the conversations we see, that somehow or other people can think that policy can be diminished down to 264 characters on a Twitter account. The fact that we just read these stories online and assume they're true when the experts are telling us something different. We have, at some level, I feel like we don't seem to have a sense of history or future anymore. It's just now, me. And that does worry me. And I think that there's a lot of big conversations about where we are from a sociological perspective and how social media has played a role in bringing these demons out in our society. And what do we do? How do we deal with it? But the lack of context, the lack of perspective, the lack of history people are showing, yeah, it's very scary and very sad. And I wish I had a clean answer for you. Now, maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe people will wake up and go, no, this is wrong. But right now, as far as I can tell, both parties have been perfectly happy just borrowing trillions of dollars, and neither one of their bases seem particularly inclined to say no.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It scares a lot of us.
Yeah.
And so with it, you touched on a little bit of everything that's going on. Certainly through the pandemic, we've also had the whole rising up of the issue of equity, of diversity, racial disparities. How does that fit into our economy when we're trying to address those issues as well?
Again, a very tough question, particularly for someone, shall we say, who's had the background I've had. So we have to appreciate that there are those around us who need a helping hand. I'm all for that, whether it's pre-K education and training programs and various ways of giving people opportunities that their history may not have allowed them to. My only modest pushback on this whole conversation is I still think of the world in terms of the haves and have-nots rather than versus the color of skin per se. There's an old there's an old expression that, yeah, it's true, most white people are rich. Most rich people are white, but not all white people are rich. We all need to focus, I think, generally on those less fortunate than us. And this is a great opportunity to do just that. We live in a world right now where, again, tight labor markets are a cure for all sorts of long-run problems. Folks who have been historically disadvantaged for whatever reason, whether it's a function of historic racism or simply being from a broken family, these folks need a helping hand, and this is the time to give it to them. This is a time where we can take them the next step, get them trained, get them into a career path. You could set these people up for a lifetime of success the way we haven't been able to in the past. So now more than ever, we need to redouble our efforts on this front because it'll pay off better now than ever before.
Okay, thanks. Well, and in the past, in some of your presentations, you've talked about how so much wealth continues to be in very small, even less than the 1%, and that we ought to look at altering our tax structure. Any thoughts on that as we've gone through this pandemic? Because I think most of us recognize that a lot of wealthy people have gotten richer through the pandemic, rather than,
Yeah. I will tell you this, that everybody's gotten richer and everybody's gotten poorer at the same time. Let's not confuse the fact that when we give ourselves $5 trillion based on $5 trillion in government debt, we all feel 5 trillion richer, and the country is not richer. It's an illusion driven by the massive amounts of government borrowing. So let's be a little careful how we define wealth from that particular perspective. And yeah, I think parts of this stimulus program were incredibly regressive. Some were very progressive, some were very regressive. I think there could have been a more scaled, more appropriate way of dealing with the circumstance, but it's history now and it doesn't really matter. Again, I go back to the basic idea that one of the biggest success stories we can have in the next few years is not so much thinking about government support for people. It's what's the old Chinese expression? You give a man a fish, he eats for a day. You train a man to fish, and he eats for a lifetime. That's where we are as an economy. That's the kind of place we are as with these labor shortages. We have an opportunity to train people to be self-sufficient, to have careers, to have a great life without necessarily having ongoing government support. It's time for us as a society to make the investments in the systems that allow people to succeed on their own feet.
Okay, and with that, how do you feel wages? Do you think right now wages are keeping up with the
They are,
supply
absolutely.
demand? Okay, so you feel like wages are just
they're growing.
out of necessity. They
They
need
never slow down. They right through this pandemic, over the last year, the people who are continue to work have seen their wages continue to rise. And again, I know that from the data. I also know it anecdotally from my own company. We've been giving people just to keep people in the door. We're having a problem with turnover like a lot of groups are right now. And yes, we are dealing with that by completely reframing our wage packages to meet demand where it is right now. Every business is going to have this conversation. It's a different world. It's not caused by the pandemic, but the pandemic accelerated a lot of underlying trends that were already there. And now we have to sort of catch up.
Great. Very, very thought-provoking. Absolutely. Okay, so you talked about how downtowns are where people, businesses are going to start migrating who might not have been there. So with our smaller cities in both Alameda County, Contra Costa County, how do we really bring back the office market? How do we retain that, whether it be commercial in office, commercial in retail, which of course is suffering, as you mentioned, because of the online shopping convenience that we all got used to in a pandemic. How do we keep businesses and entice them to our small cities?
Right. Well, again, to your point, land use policies have got to change. We're going to have to realize that a certain portion of consumption is not going to come from local neighborhoods anymore. And as a lot of it's going to be done online. And what that means is, from a land use perspective, we need to think, okay, well, we're going to need more industrial. We're going to need more systems to allow goods to be moved by truck. And we still need more residential. There are a lot of, in fact, the company Beacon has been growing quite a bit. And one of the places we've been growing is in doing more economic development, direct work. And some of my folks were talking about ways you could think about dealing with retail. For example, making suburban retail into mixed use is a huge way of using underserved lots. And the retail will be benefited because they're going to have people right there on spot. You're going to have more what I would call that more current buy, more restaurants and convenience stores.
People want the experience.
Exactly. It's right there, right? Changing retail zoning to allow for companies that actually do more online kind of stuff. It's a little bit of a shift, making a retail a little bit industrial-esque is another way of thinking about it. And that's important as well. But again, I'm going to go back to this idea that suburban office in particular is going to have a tough time. You're going to see migration, particularly of tech jobs, more towards these downtown areas. What do you do with the suburban office? Well, again, healthcare is a desperately needed thing. There's always going to be demand for that. Let's start thinking about how to convert some of these office buildings into medical buildings. What kind of changes do you need there? So again, it's a way of stepping back and thinking about that land use policy, the kind of zoning, the kind of activities that go on. This is a great time to sit down with a board of advisors and some good, smart land use people and think about how do we need to change this in order to adapt to these changing circumstances. Now more than ever, we need to do this. It's a different world. We have to adapt.
Yeah, well, and speaking of a different world, let's talk a little bit about electrification. You've got Industrial Association here. There's a lot of demand, or a lot of, not even demand, but a lot of pushing for people saying, we want you to have a just transition away from fossil fuels. Do you see us really moving toward a total electrification so quickly at the expense of petroleum, natural gas, other alternatives? There's a big push right now to have cities say, we're going to ban all natural gas in new construction. No more, homes with your gas stove, with your gas water heater. You've got to go completely electric. Too bad if there's a power outage. You're going to be cold and you won't have hot water and you can't cook. But that's no bias on my part.
I got to tell you, what you had to glance at these questions. You're really throwing a lot of hardballs at me here. You're supposed to. Well,
you know what? I have too much fun with you, Chris. When these pop up, I think Chris can handle this. I'm not giving him these softball ones.
Okay, so I got a lot of different comments on that. As you know, I'm full of opinions. Not all right, but most of them are, I like to think. And if it's not right, I'm always willing to get an email to correct me. So here's a couple of things I think on listen, I agree. I think oil companies agree that ultimately as a world, we need to start moving away from carbon. I mean, come on, global warming's real, people. We're dealing with this. We need to start making real efforts to change things up. And yeah, investing in solar and this kind of stuff is a great way of moving it forward. However, I do have a problem with what I would call some of the knee-jerk efforts to shut down the oil industry in the state. Blaming the oil industry is incorrect. The oil industry is supplying the demand for oil driven by people still driving traditional combustion engines, right? Don't go after the oil guys, go after the cars. You got to work on speeding up the electrification of the fleet. You got to work on making our roadways ready for this. You need to discourage people from consuming fossil fuels. And if you just shut down the oil industries and you don't actually stop people from doing what they're doing, they don't actually slow down demand, you're only fooling yourself, because we're just going to have to import this oil from Saudi Arabia or Iran or Alaska or wherever it's going to come from, as opposed to just producing it and refining it here. So attacking supply is well, it reminds me of yelling at the IRS when they're collecting taxes. Excuse me, the taxes the IRS are collecting are set up by Congress. Yell at Congress, not the IRS. They're just doing their job, right? It's funny how we want to blame the oil companies for this when it's us. We're the ones buying the oil and consuming it. So I would argue, focus on the demand side, and we're going to get there. Be patient, let it happen. We're already made huge advances. I just got solar on my house, so we have to let that happen. And as for natural gas and on your stove, I'm sorry, don't take my gas away, please, Supervisor. I need my gas. I love my.
No, you and a lot of other people I hear from all the time. So anyway,
can't we find something else to do? Can't we figure out how to keep cows from pooping so much or something?
Well, all things have to be considered. Absolutely. Other big social issue is homelessness, and I know you and I on my board of supervisors have had some very robust discussions about both affordable housing and then the issue of homelessness. What is your economic data telling you? A lot of money, but it was definitely, and rightfully so, during the pandemic, or at least rightfully so from my standpoint, we poured a lot of money into making sure we could house as many homeless people as we could in a pandemic to save lives, to slow down the spread. And now we still need to provide housing post-pandemic. Your thoughts?
And to be clear, a lot of those housing projects aren't even filled. Because a lot of people homeless don't want to go there. And the reason for that is, I'm sorry, I'm just going to say this out loud. My personal belief is homelessness is not driven by a housing crisis, but driven by the mental health support crisis in the state of California. The vast majority of people on the streets on a pretty long-term basis have mental health problems or addiction problems. Functionally speaking, that lifestyle is what they are pursuing, and they're not willing to go into centers where that lifestyle may be prevented, as the case may be. They used to live in flop houses. The flop houses have been converted to condos and apartments, and yeah, now they're a little bit more on the street than they used to be. But again, we have two options. We can build lots of supply and have flop houses where they can go and their problems, their misery will be hidden, like we were 25 years ago. Or we can take this on in a broader perspective, which is acknowledge we have a public mental health problem and start putting the resources and dealing with it appropriately. And I'll tell you, that's a thorny, ugly conversation. It's expensive, it's difficult to deal with folks like this. There are no easy solutions, either from what I would call a monetary standpoint, or indeed from a personal independence freedom standpoint. There's a lot of questions about when you have someone who's living on the streets, largely voluntary. You've given them opportunities to come in and they don't. What do? Do we forcibly put them into a mental health hospital or an addiction center? Are we comfortable as a society making these choices? It's not easy. And I don't have a clean answer for you. I'm not the expert on this, but what I can tell you is to pretend this is an affordable housing crisis, to me, is functionally incorrect.
Yeah, well, and I agree with you. There are so many supportive services that are really needed for those living on the street, and affordable housing is a completely different issue. And there are people who are very hard times, and we do have some wonderful programs to help house those individuals. And it is a challenge for those of us on a county level who deal with the behavioral health issues.
More than it.
Yeah, and I agree. Luckily, we're looking at some great new alternatives as well to help house that population. So I think I see Peter has appeared, and I think Peter's ready to sort of close us down. I want to thank you, Chris. You have been fabulous as always. And I want to thank everyone who has been sending us questions and comments. And I didn't get to everyone, but I tried to get as many as I possibly could. And sorry if I gave you too many of those hardball ones, but you handled them well.
I just, I know people have a lot of strong feelings about these issues, as the case may be. And like I said, I think in general, what I appreciate about the conversation today is that we can have a civil conversation about difficult issues, acknowledge both sides, and find the truth in the middle, because that's the path forward. And the conversations I have, that's mainly what I'm looking for, is that path forward. And I hope today helped.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues, to Peter and to Keith.
Thank you, Supervisor Anderson. Supervisor Carson, any last minute thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, I just thank you for this partnership. This was an incredible update, and I expected exactly what I got from Chris today. So that was good. So I'm just hoping that everyone will help us to kind of come together as a networking group and continue to be a voice for business in this particular case in government. Because the lobbying and the education is something that we need to do jointly in order to have our joint voices heard here in the region. And we look forward to seeing everybody soon. But thanks very much. This is wonderful getting together with you.
Always fun.
Great. Supervisor Carson, I can only echo what you just said. You took the words right out of my mouth. The collaboration between these two organizations strengthens us greater than the sum of the parts. It's really a good thing to see. Supervisor Carson, thank you for your participation.
Thank you,
Supervisor
Peter.
Anderson, terrific job. Thank you for guiding us through the question and answer period, and for throwing those hard balls so that Chris could take the swing and knock them out of the park. I was remiss at the outset for not thanking our sponsors, so I'm going to give a double thanks to Phillips 66 and the Western States Petroleum Association. Without you, we couldn't do this sort of thing. It's really great. And then I also want to acknowledge Stephen Bader and Mark Hughes, the directors of our respective organizations, to reach out, to collaborate, to pull this all together. Really, really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you both very much. So East Bay EDA, Industrial Association, thank you, all our guests. Thank you for joining us today. I'm sure it was as educational as you expected it to be. And then finally, Chris, thank you again. We always appreciate your insight. And with that, we are right at the noon hour. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon.